Hello, everyone, and welcome to Futurearly Dialogues. It is April 24th, Friday, and I am delighted to have a very good and dear friend, Warwick Powell, Professor Warwick Powell, with us today. Warwick is just returning after 3.5 weeks of being in China. He has published a masterpiece, a book called The Macroeconomics in a Time of Monsters, which we will discuss among many other things. As you may know, Futurely Dialogues is something that is close to my heart and an add-on to the column that I write on Substack, and where I decode the undercurrents of, shaping and undercurrents of what is shaping our geopolitics, the economic power, strategic risk, and trade choke points. And no better person than Warwick being with us today. Now, for some of you who may not know Warwick, Warwick is both a practitioner and a scholar. He's pioneered design and application of blockchain technologies way before anybody knew what blockchain is, and he's a master of supply chains. He holds a PhD from University of Portsmouth for his work on blockchain, supply chain, and the evolving contours that is affecting the lives of all of us. Graduated first-class honors at Griffith University, and with a thesis on Chinese Marxist theories of economic development, and was the first non-science recipient of the Griffith University Medal for Academic Excellence. All of this is very much related to the world we're living in and this power play between the United States and China. He then had a very diverse career spanning 3+ decades, professional life, as a tutor and lecturer in Chinese history, European cultural history. He has supported and worked in government, in Queensland government, and, at the Director General of the Office of the Cabinet at the time of the Honorable Kevin Rudd, Australia's 26th Prime Minister. And among and above all of this, he is a champion for dialogue. He's a champion for, flowing of his knowledge and his learnings, and that makes him ever more special. So I am pleased to welcome Warwick to our program. And for all of you who are watching, do please subscribe to Futurely, press the like button and share it, because these are the nuggets of wisdom that I, as a truffle hunter, try to gather. And today we're with Warwick. Warwick, welcome to Futurely Dialogues.
It's great to be back with you, Ali, and I hope the last few weeks since we last touched base have treated you as well as the world can treat people at the moment.
Well, as we're going to talk about it, and the title of your book has the reference to Antonio Gramsci's "We do live in the time of monsters," indeed. But why don't you take us to 40,000 feet, and how the idea of this book, The Macroeconomics in a Time of Monsters, came about, and to unpack this element of systemic exchange value, which is at the core of your new book.
Yeah, look, I'll do my best and I'll try and keep it. Every time I speak about the book, I think I slightly improve on trying to condense it down. Look, the book really started 30 odd years ago with a remark made to me when I was doing my honours, but a couple of cubicles down from me was a colleague who was doing his PhD. He was from the oil and gas industry, and we were talking about all sorts of stuff one day, and he made the offhanded comment that, as far as he was concerned, based on his own experiences in industry and his own thinking, that what economists describe or use the word value to talk about is actually just fundamentally energy. Now, none of that made too big of an impact on me, but obviously enough of an impact to lodge in the back of the mind. And throughout my working life, I had ongoing dealings with the energy industry directly. I've had ongoing engagements in the mining sector, whether it was in coal mining or metalliferous mining. But ultimately, I guess what brought this book together was a combination of two things. One was the work that I'd been doing for probably the last 10 years around supply chain systems and the role of information systems within that, and how supply chains um, worked in a systemic sense. And that featured in the first book, which I wrote about how China was digitalizing supply chains and introducing blockchain technologies to help China accomplish a whole range of strategic and policy objectives in relation to that. But what that led me to think more deeply about again was how the economic system itself is deeply integrated, and what is the cost for one business is actually the income for another, and that these things are tied together, and that's the supply chain dimension to it. And once I started rethinking this idea of economic systems through a supply chain lens, it eventually led me back down the path of classical economics and the issues of value. And so I went down that rabbit hole again and found useful tools to think about the problems, and ultimately, I guess, developed a fairly eclectic or non-doctrinaire synthesis of four main things. And I'll wrap it up just by noting what those things are.
Well,
One is classical economics, and its concerns around questions of value,
mhm.
circulation, production, and reproduction. Secondly, is the idea of endogenous money as a right and as a means of circulation within the system. Thirdly, is the idea of information as an energetic property in and of itself, but as a fundamental feature of how the elements of this system that we call the social economy or the political economy actually coordinates and fits together. And the last piece, which is the most grounding piece of it all, which lends it to the name of the book, is the material layer, which really drew on foundational science. You know, it's almost going back to high school science as far as getting your head or getting the feet back on the ground. And that really was about thermodynamics and the first and second laws of thermodynamics, which is that energy isn't created or destroyed, it just changes form. And
Hmm.
secondly, that the metabolic system that we call nature is one that tends towards entropy, which is dissipation, fragmentation, chaos, complexity, etc., etc. And what the book tries to do, first and foremost, is integrate those into a coherent theoretical apparatus, and then use that or use parts of that theoretical apparatus to explore China's own economic development experience, some recent dimensions of America's economic development experience, and then wrap it up with some rather open-ended discussions around some critical issues.
Well, it's a wonderful read, and I think it's one of those books that should be the companion for a decade to come because it touches on many nerves. I think one of the terminologies you've used is this SEV, this systemic exchange value.
Yeah.
And I felt like systemic exchange value, Security Exchange Commission, SEC and SEV. And is there a systemic competition shaping in and around energy? The way you put it is very elegant because it's not just about oil and gas, it's not just about renewables, it's not just about, solar or wind. It is that you have, to my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying productivity is nothing but energy in motion.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, the way we look at America's economy today, somewhat that energy is either kept among a very tight circle, but it's not running through the rest of the society and economy. Can you expand on that if that makes any sense to you?
So the idea of systemic exchange value really draws on that classical economics tradition.
Mm.
And the classical economics tradition goes back to the French physiocrats who were interested in the sources of value, and they came to the view that the source of value, all value, was nature, and for them that was embodied in agriculture.
Hmm.
They didn't believe that industry, as we understand it, was actually a source of value. But of course, those who came after the physiocrats developed a view about value that understood or that took as a starting point that in fact industry was a source of value as well. And for those folk, which is Marx, Smith, and Ricardo, they explored this question of value through this idea of labor theory of value in their own ways, that the source of value is labor. Now, what it seemed to me is that both the physiocrats and the labor theory of value thread within classical economy was trying to get at, but in a sense couldn't quite get to it, and partly because of the theoretical and scientific limitations of the time, was actually something that was universal to all of this. And the universality piece is thermodynamics. So we can now introduce the idea that, in fact, the source of value and value itself is the energy potential in nature and how humans seek to harvest that, store it, mobilize it, transform it, ultimately in the name of producing things that other humans find useful and enabling the social system to become more complex and to reproduce itself. So that is the idea, I guess, that underpinned all of this. The fact that it's systemic really goes to this question of the idea of a nested supply chain system. So economic systems are ultimately connected systems. And as I mentioned, the cost of one is the income of the other. And in a physical sense, of course, that also means that as commodities or products flow in one direction, they enable the next activity to take place. So this is this
True.
idea of value in motion, and energy in motion. And once we start to view the system as a dynamic system that flows and has blockages and which has different networks of circulation, we begin to, I think, have a better grasp of, firstly, the sources of crises when they do occur, but also have a better understanding of what the fundamental underpinning dialectic, if you will, of the system at large. And it's the dialectic that has, on one side of the machinery, if you will, nature's own dynamic, which is towards entropy. But on the other side is the human dynamic, which seeks to harness that and gain control of it and bring order to unfolding complexity, dissipation, and chaos. So it's the combination of these two things together that drives economic systems, either in ways that innovate and renew their energetic capabilities, or ultimately entropy overcomes the capacity of human social systems to harness it. And so to understand value, we must look at value in systemic terms.
I want to bring it a bit to our current state of affairs globally. You have spent a great part of your life following supply chains. And as we speak, sadly, out of, again, I would say, another act of hubris, a war that wasn't necessary, a war of choice, has come to manifest itself this time not as midnight hammer, but in epic fury, and has created epic chaos because of the closure of Strait of Hormuz and blockade. Does America understand what you are saying in terms of the energy flow, not in terms of oil and gas, that once you block the energy for one part of global community, whether it's in CHIPS Act, whether it's in embargoes, whether it's in sanctions, through that thermodynamic analogy and correlation that you so masterfully have outlined, it's going to be a boomerang and hit back America in its head and lead to an atrophy and entropy. Is that the right way of looking
Well,
at it?
there is a risk to that because complex systems are non-linear
Mhm.
and complex systems have feedback loops in them, and consequently also as a result of that unintended consequences. Look, I think the United States' particular approach at the moment is underpinned by probably three layers. It's
Mhm.
probably a nice way of thinking about it. And I draw these three layers from the work of Ferdinand Braudel, a historian from the Annales School, French historian. And he described history in a broad conceptual sense as having different kinds of temporalities, different times that work. We have what we call the event, which are
Mhm.
the things in our immediate moment. And events are set against what he called the conjuncture, which
Mhm.
is a period of, 10, 20, 30 years or so of that sort of immediate backdrop, the dynamics that shape that period. But that shorter period, the conjuncture, is set against the longue durée.
Mhm.
And to understand the event, we kind of need to understand each of these layers.
Mhm.
So the longue durée component is the thermodynamic component. And what happens is that economic systems, um, by harnessing the energy available to us in nature and doing things with that, also confront the limitations of nature itself. And the principal idea here is energy return on energy invested, the acronym EROEI. And the idea there is that to gain access to a given amount of energy and to make it available for useful work later, a certain amount of energy has to be expended as well.
Mhm.
So if we go on a hunt or an animal goes hunting, an animal has to use up a bunch of energy in the hunt to capture something that then replenishes the energy that it's used up. And complex social systems are able to undertake an activity to capture something that has a much higher energy return for the effort and the energy expended was required. So the longue durée tells us that over the course of the last 200 odd years, human societies have really hit upon an incredibly high energy return on investment
Mhm.
capability. Firstly, through burning coal to drive steam turbines, and eventually discovering oil and gas, or this gas and oil. And when human societies have the capabilities of extracting these and then harnessing that energy that is above and beyond what we need for our day-to-day reproduction, societies then begin to be able to do all sorts of other things. Now, now nature itself, of course, says, well, at some point, all the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, is harvested, and for each next additional amount of energy you need, with a given technology capability, it is going to cost you more energy to get.
Interesting.
And so we end up with this downward turn. There might be abundant resource available, such as shale oil. There's lots of shale oil available. But to access a unit of energy of shale oil today requires much more energy committed than it did 10 years ago. So even though there's a lot of it, it's actually energetically more expensive to get, which means you've got less surplus available for all these other things in a
Mhm.
society. And a society doesn't consciously notice this straight away. So the system works, in a sense, through the cunning of entropy, right? So drawing on Hegel, who talked about the cunning of reason, we can kind of talk about the cunning of entropy. And entropy is ever present, but we don't always observe it until
Mhm.
it becomes obvious. So as it becomes obvious, and it manifests itself in all sorts of ways, um, buildings that are falling down, non-maintained infrastructure, non-updated things, homelessness, people going without food, etc., etc. These are all symptoms of a combination of a declining energy return on energy invested in a social settlement context of a particular distributional arrangement. So if the surplus is declining or the efficiency is declining, and you've got a system that concentrates control of what there is into a smaller and smaller set of hands, you start to create all sorts of other problems by virtue of neglect. So a country confronted with this eventually has to make some decisions, or companies and entities and humans and others within a society. They begin to make decisions. And these decisions actually go to how to deal with a declining energetic efficiency in their operations. One thing they can do, of course, is to find new sources of energy that are, again, easier to get. with existing technologies, the discovery of a new energy field, for example. And then you can sort of renew with a version 2 of your status quo. Alternatively, you can develop access to nature's other forms of energy that become energetically efficient by developing new energy generating technologies, et cetera, et cetera. You know, whether it's, the development of nuclear power, ongoing work in fusion, renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the second thing we can do. The third thing that societies can do is purchase low entropy energy from others. It trades. Um, and of course, the last thing a society may choose to do is go and take it from somebody else.
Well,
Thermodynamic imperialism. Okay, so that's the longue durée backdrop. The middle piece, the conjuncture, is arguably the 20 to 30 years of unipolarity. And mixed in with that is, of course, this deep sense of American exceptionalism and entitlement,
entitlement,
together
yeah.
with a millenarian eschatology, not only in relation to the American body politic and the political culture of the United States itself, but how that is intertwined with a millenarian eschatology of Israeli politics as well. So we can broadly say that that's the conjuncture, which has manifested itself in long-standing American strategies vis-a-vis Israel, the greater Israel ambitions, and how to clear the decks in the region to enable that to happen. And the last piece of the deck, if you will, as you know better than anyone else, is Iran. So you go back to the 2009 Brookings Institute report, the strategy paper.
Which path to Persia?
That's the one. And going back 30 years, this, in a sense, was a strategic canvas. More recently, aligned with that has been the concern about China's rise. But China's rise was a latter day proposition because the conjuncture was already concerned about this broader question of Greater Israel in the Middle East. Now, we can talk a bit later about, whether or not this framing of American ambitions around Iran in the context of its containment of China makes sense or not. But so that's just sort of conjuncture. And of course, the immediate moment is how a particular president was ultimately persuaded to seek a military solution to a whole bunch of these sorts of issues when every prior president for the last 30 years has rebuffed attempts to drag America into an explicit military intervention on Iran. So we piece that together, longue durée conjuncture event, and I think we start to get a sense of what the story looks like.
That is fascinating, and I enjoy that bridge and the arc that you painted. Many of the words you're using start with E, the empire, entropy, energy, and entitlement. And I think through this, America may have felt that it has an unlimited credit card, particularly post 1991, and started swiping. Swiping, in military adventures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. And now the card has been declined in Iran when it swiped, just to use a metaphor. Is there a danger in a financially broke empire? And the reason I'm saying that, before coming to our call and our dialogue, I did a bit of a desk research. These numbers are not, foreign to you. And the acronym jumped at me. I love literature and writing and vocabulary. It came up as SCAM, SCAM, scam. Student loan, $1.66 trillion. Credit card loans, $1.28 trillion. Auto loans, $1.67 trillion. Mortgage loans, $13.17 trillion. That is $18.8 trillion of loans and debts, Warwick, in an economy that is in entropy, in an empire that has lost empathy, and still feels that it has to swipe the card and the transaction has to go through, otherwise it has to break the shop. Are we envisioning a hyper financialization? And where is this going in that thermoeconomics that you are painting?
So the way that the system actually works is that there's a fundamental substrate. So it's a metabolic system with those four components that I talked about. And the metabolic substrate is where energy is continually transformed and is in motion. And the speed at which that transformation can take place is it doesn't accelerate quickly.
Mhm.
Nature and humans' ability to mobilize and interact with it and extract from it and all of that goes through fits and starts of technical advance,
Mhm.
if you want to use the word advance, or technical development, which transforms the ability to interact with nature and to draw from nature's reservoirs of energy to
Mhm.
then do what we would call useful work. Now, so that's the substrate. But to mobilize that in a complex economic system where you've got a division of labor, we have something that we call money. And money is not much more than a unit of account and a right to a claim on future value forms. That's it, right? Money in and of itself is not something that can be used in production systems. So if we break society and economic systems down into two fundamental propositions, it needs food for people and fuel for machines. Money in and of itself is neither food nor machine or
Mhm.
fuel. Okay, and so it's a means of mobilizing things because it confers upon the counterparty the right to make a claim on something else in the future. So the creation of these rights, either through bank credit or through, and you describe four massive areas of private credit and debt, and also through the activities of government expenditure and taxation, which of course contributes to the leaching out of system liquidity. You put this together, and the financial component, or what I call the exchange value component of the value architecture, will tend to grow faster than than the substrate can ultimately meet the claims that are being made on it. And a couple of things tend to happen. So as the exchange value circuits expand, the claims therefore on the future continue to grow. The pressures emerge from time to time as claims are being made on future value that actually isn't available. And a few things are done to deal with that. One is to actually, in practical terms, we refinance.
Mhm.
In other words, we kick the can down the road a bit further. Um, that tends to save the blushes of the system for a while. But at some point in time, we can't keep refinancing these things. And the gap between the scale of the claims that are available now and what essentially human productive systems can actually meet grows to a point where we actually have a massive impairment of the financial architecture itself, the balance sheet. Interestingly, when that happens, the physical part of the world actually doesn't change straight away. We know that, when a factory or a business that owns a factory goes broke, goes bankrupt, the factory's still there. The very next day, the buildings and everything, they're all still there. Over time, however, if there is no new liquidity injected and made available to mobilizing those resources again, then of course they suffer from entropy. Machinery seizes up, it rusts, the building starts to fall apart. Or humans actually intervene, pull it apart, and sell things off to recover liquidity. So we know how that kind of works. And the risk in the United States at the moment is that the gap between the substrate and the claims that have been created about the future substrate is growing so fast now at an aggregate level that anywhere in this whole stack, there is fragility, that the circulation of money to pay off loans, to pay interest, etc., is simply not going to be able to keep up with the demands of that expansion. And the risk we run, of course, is that there will be a financial crisis somewhere. It could be in any of those four areas you've described. It could be triggered in any of those four areas. It could be triggered by the popping of the equities bubble, particularly around AI. Any of these places now are symptoms of systemic fragility where the thermoeconomic material substrate is no longer able to, in a sense, shoulder the burden that is now being placed upon it by the claims that we've created and and let loose into the world.
Interesting. Just last week, in a collaboration with Nel Bonilla, whom I'm sure you know, on Substack, we wrote a piece called The Emerging Architecture Joint Piece, a two-part of Interregnum. You're coming back from China after 3.5 weeks. President Trump has to go there by May 14th and 15th. It reminds me of Ernest Hemingway's How Did You Go Bankrupt? Gradually and then suddenly.
Yeah.
What do you think he will be aiming to achieve in context of this macro beautiful picture you have painted for us here today? And what are your observations after your latest trip, which is a frequent for you, of 3.5 weeks, feel in this thermodynamic era of geopolitics as well? How does China see its role in this transition?
The Hemingway quote, by the way, is actually deeply insightful in
Thank you.
ways that I think many people might not fully grasp. You know, the idea of going broke slowly and then suddenly
Yeah.
is actually precisely this dynamic at work of entropy, where it is not noticed for a long time until you go over the edge. It's a bit like also drawing on a reservoir of energy in nature, such as an oil field. And until the pump starts to suck air, you actually don't know that you've hit rock bottom.
Mm.
And so, whilst it's flowing, even though it's diminishing every time it sucks more out, you actually have no idea that you're reaching you're reaching that Hemingway moment, right? Of going from sudden to, from gradual to sudden. And system dynamic thinkers often talk about it in terms of thresholds, right? That at
Mhm.
some point there's path dependencies, and then we hit thresholds. And whilst we're traipsing along, we often have no idea that the threshold is about to come upon us. So, firstly, I think it's a great way of summarizing some of these critical issues for people to be thinking about. China, of course, has been thinking about this energy problem for a long time,
Mhm.
partly because of its own development challenges going back to 1949, needing to tackle the situation of a country coming off the back of 2+ decades of war, where life expectancy was barely 40 years of age. And of course, on the back of that, another, 70, 80 years of essentially being dismembered by foreign colonial powers, whether they were from the West or Asia's version of the West, which was Japan. So China needed to embark on its own energetic renewal.
Mhm.
And it did that through harnessing all sorts of very conventional technologies at the time, building coal-fired power stations and all those sorts of things. But eventually, I guess, we reached, say, the late 1990s into the early 2000s, and China was starting to um, mobilize as an industrial society. Early days of industry, but certainly a big country with lots of people starting to become more reliant on oil and the products of oil for transportation. So we went from coal trains to diesel trains, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so that was the sort of energetic process. But one of the concerns that China's leaders had going all the way back 20 odd years ago was this concern about exposure to oil supplies from the Middle East. And unsurprisingly, that was because the Americans actually explicitly talked about interdicting Chinese oil supplies from the Middle East at the Strait of Malacca.
Mhm.
Hu Jintao, the Chinese president at the time, 2002, 2003, actually observed. He coined the idea that China confronted the Malacca dilemma. Okay, so going back 23 years, 24 years, leadership in China explicitly acknowledged and understood this risk. So what did it do? Well, it did, the first thing was to diversify sources of oil. Now,
Mhm.
you can't just, you know, magic that into existence. That requires effort. It requires the development of its own oil industry. It requires building pipelines and ports and other things to take oil from other parts of the world. It often requires the ability to reconfigure refineries to deal with the chemistry of other crudes. So that was the first thing China did, was to diversify its sources of crude and the way that it could handle it. The second thing it did was begun to uh, strive for more efficiency in the use of existing energy sources, predominantly coal and gas, to a point where a lot of advances were made in improving efficiency and cleanliness in the use of coal. Big coal producer in its own right, but also imported coal from many other parts of the world, including Australia, Indonesia, Canada, South Africa, and Russia. You can see the diversification there. Also diversified into other sources of energy that it could develop locally. So with new technologies, it was able to develop things like nuclear power stations. And then come 2005 or so, maybe a little bit later, it began to develop renewable energy technologies and systems, particularly around solar and then wind. Now, as everybody in the industry knows, in the early days of renewable energy technologies, they weren't particularly energetically efficient. Solar panels at that time were notoriously fickle. If there was a little bit of dust on them, that was the end of that. So in the early days, they were, solar energy was a very energetically inefficient kind of energy. But nonetheless, China persevered.
Which
And,
whipped
and
into your comment that, the energy you have to put in to get the energy out, which
correct,
it's
exactly.
fascinating.
And so effort was made to develop these new energy systems. Come Um, and it took probably about 10 years, really, 2005 through to 2015, before some of the really serious breakthroughs started to take place, where renewable energy systems actually began to be competitive with more conventional kinds of energy generation. China also um, began, as a result of this, investing significantly in the development of energy storage solutions,
Mhm.
battery technologies, um, because renewable energies are intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind's not always blowing. So you've got to be able to store the energy that you harvest when it's available and enable you to make use of it later. So batteries became a big technological development frontier. And you start putting all of this together. The next obvious thing was, well, we need to reduce, firstly, the relative dependency on gasoline for transportation, and eventually aim to reduce in absolute terms the amount of gasoline that is used, whether it's diesel or petrol. And by, you know, 2012, big investments were starting to be made to develop the what has now become the Chinese EV sector. We've now got cutting edge things happening continually in things like fusion, clean energy enabled, um, highly dense storage solutions, namely hydrogen and other storage capability, as well as developments in edge, system edge energy harvesting technologies. So these are things that we call triboelectric nanogenerators. And it enables the harvesting of ambient environmental energy. Very modest vibrations. If we embedded the technology into our clothes, it would actually harness the energy just from our movement. And these technologies are now finding their ways into very, very small devices, such as sensors that enable these devices to be powered at the very edges. You don't need electricity systems taking electricity to them. They actually are self-contained. So
Interesting.
this massive effort was made by China to, over the course of 25 years, transform the structure of its energy system for its economy, the energetic foundations, to a point now where in 2024, China essentially reached peak diesel. So the amount of diesel that the Chinese economy as a whole, which continues growing, uses today is less than what it used in 2024.
Fascinating.
And the expectation is that by 2030, as part of this 15th five-year plan, that China will also reach peak oil. Okay. So the long run strategy has been to transform the structure of its energetic foundations, be less exposed to external sources, to a point where today now the overall energy structure uh, uses, or about 20% of it is based on oil.
Wow.
Um, and and that oil comes from many sources, and about somewhere in the order of 6.5% or so comes from the Persian Gulf. Okay,
Mm.
so in terms of China's overall economic system now, 6.5% of it is dependent upon movements through the Gulf. And when that has become problematic, which it has alternatives. Alternatives such as Russian oil. And Sergei Lavrov last week in Beijing actually made it very clear that Russia has the willingness and the capacity to offset the short-term loss of Middle Eastern oil for China. Interestingly, I saw a report, it might have been a Reuters report or even an FT report, that talked about how long-term gas contracts, Russian gas contracts with China, sees China actually paying a substantial discounted price for Russian gas as well. But so China's sort of been working very hard to transform the structure of its energy systems or energy requirements of its economy writ large. And that has put it in good stead to deal with this current crisis. This current crisis, of course, Ali, will unleash another set of things because if the flows through the Strait of Hormuz continues to be a trickle and the world system loses 15 to 20%, some of which will be offset by additional flows from Russia and from the US, but certainly not all, we're going to see demand destruction in parts of the world.
True.
There will be things that once used, the products of oil, that simply won't be able to pay for the cost of those products that it once did. And they
Funny
will
you
stop
say
doing
that, Warwick. Sorry, disrupting you. The other day, I read that there is a massive panic in Japan among the dentists and many others for the PPE blue
it.
gloves
Yep,
because it's,
yep.
so a lot of people immediately hone in and zoom in on oil, whereas acid sulfuric for, everything that you think, even from mining, from fertilizers, LNG, you cannot, I mean, the Saudis are excited that East-West pipeline, you cannot ship LNG through the pipeline on overland. So there is a bit of a
Um,
naivety, and I
there's a
appreciate the
bunch of
point.
stuff, right?
Yes.
There's a bunch of stuff. Helium,
Yeah,
sulfur. Look, sulfur will obviously affect sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid is necessary for about 20% of copper production in
there
the
you
world.
go. And
Bum,
that's
bum, bum, bum. Right. So
absolutely
there's a whole set of propagations
the
that
cascading effect. Yeah.
that will still have to work their way through the systems. And of course, we have the issues around fertilizers, right? That is manufactured with
Yeah.
gas. China's reasonably well served with its own fertilizers, which it makes, basically through coal energy. But globally, obviously, there's a lot that has to work through the system yet, and some of that won't become obvious for 6 months, 12 months.
Yeah,
Helium is an important input, for example, in the manufacture of medical devices and
MRI
equipment,
machines, yeah.
MRI machines.
But
So, the
is
list the
there
list just goes on and on and on, right? So when this happens, there's obviously massive demand destruction. The United States isn't immune from any of this, right? So when the President Trump says things like, "Oh, we don't use the Strait of Hormuz. It really doesn't affect us. We're self-sufficient in energy." Well, that in and of itself is not even true, because the US is actually a net importer of crude. It needs the medium sour crude from the
yeah,
Middle East for some of its refineries that
yeah.
were built in the days before the United States, well, particularly the West Coast refineries, right? So the US's ability to export energy is actually in part contingent on the ongoing availability of crude oil from the Middle East anyway. So and of course it's going to be affected by all those other things: helium,
Yeah.
um, uh, fertilizer, um, the consequences of a big hit on copper production.
LNG
Um,
for, I mean, we're already, you blink of an eye, winter is here, it's just
so the effects are going to be expansive. They will not only work their way through supply chain systems in that nested sense that I talked about, as they cascade linearly, but they'll also cascade horizontally because there are nodes within these supply chain networks in our world where the things that are made in a node affect multiple industries that then have the next round of cascades. This is obviously a very, very serious shakeup to the structures of global industrial capitalism that have evolved over 300 years.
That's fascinating. I am mindful of your time joining me late at night. I want to go back to what you said about MRI machines. I was talking to a friend yesterday and I said the world economy is like somebody who has a fractured bone or a broken leg. And sometimes, if you've gone through that experience, when you're warm, you don't know. You may run for another few hours, but it's broken already. And a lot of people think that oh, it can be corrected. I think the cascading effect hasn't even rippled through yet fully to be absorbed. So hence the metaphor of MRI. But two questions before we wrap up, Warwick. And one is that how much of this is related to the very fact that, after Deng Xiaoping, we had Jiang Zemin, who was an electrical engineer, Hu Jintao, who was a hydraulic engineer, and, Xi Jinping, who's studied chemical engineering. And on the other side, Obama, Biden, Clinton, all lawyers. And for Donald Trump, I don't have to say, and George Bush Sr., and Reagan, there is a systemic difference in continuity in thinking. And you see in United States, the creation of bills, acts, tariffs higher than the patents and innovation. How much of that is related to this structural change? So is there a thermo intellectual deficit as well? I'm not talking about Bay Area, don't take me wrong.
Yeah.
It's not about that there are not brilliant minds in America, plenty of them. But in the governance, I
Yeah.
think we have a Congress that is in coma, a Senate that is sedated, and people who are running the show who are just, paper pushers.
Look, that's the Dan Wang thesis, right? Which is, China's got engineers and America's got lawyers. I don't think that that's quite right as a framing, but it is certainly hinting at something that is worth noting. So it's not entirely wrong either, but I think it needs a little bit more teasing out.
Please.
And in many regards, it's not simply that you've got leaders who are educated in these things. It's the fact that Chinese uh, politics, and governmental priorities going all the way back to 1949 have been around economic development focused on improving the physical welfare of people. Remember, I said that in the immediate aftermath of the foundation of New China, which came on the back of all the years of war and the century of humiliation, etc., life expectancy was barely 40 years of age. Literacy and numeracy was in the pits. And so an entire country had to be rebuilt. So there was an immediate material requirement to be focused on certain kinds of things anyway. But there's actually another part of this story, and this is a part that many people, particularly Western observers and analysts, feel very uncomfortable about. And that is the role of Marxism and Leninism and Chinese Marxism as an economic governance framework. Marxism is often viewed by Western observers as ideological. It fulfills ideological purposes. Whereas in the Chinese context, it is much more than ideology, in that it's actually a way of framing the world and understanding the world and how it works. And it means that Chinese policymakers from the bottom to the top have all got a sensibility to the distinction between use value and exchange value and how they actually interact with each other. So this distinction is foundational to my own book, which obviously I draw from the annals of classical economics. And by being focused on these things and what Marxism calls the forces of production, Chinese government and the mentality of government was honed in on the problems related to this issue of forces of production, production systems, system circulation, etc., etc. On the other side of the fence, the Americans, it's not that they're full of lawyers. It's actually that the economic system and the economic logic of capitalism with American characteristics from the 1920s onwards increasingly became dominated by the forces of finance capital. And the forces of finance capital are principally concerned about the abstractions of exchange value, not the materiality of use values. And so conceptually, we have this entire apparatus of thinking that shapes how government works. Thinking where, excuse me, financial metrics actually define the outcome, where GDP, notwithstanding the warnings of the inventor, if you will, of the idea of GDP, Simon Kuznets, notwithstanding his warnings in testimony to Congress that GDP was not the be-all and end-all, it became the be-all and end-all. That institutions continued to expand around finance capital, that privileged the fast turnover, the accelerated circuits of what I described earlier, the monetary circuits, where profit could be monetized in hyper accelerated circuits, as opposed to the boring old world of material transformation. And over time, and this really began in the 1950s in earnest, finance capital began to monetize profit within American capitalism by hollowing out the real economy of America and channel increasing amounts of circulation into the channels of fictitious capital, the expansion of the stock exchange, which of course we know goes all the way, goes a long way back. But it wasn't just about raising money for new businesses. It became foundational to trading. We know, for instance, with the development of technologies around and financial innovations, we saw the burgeoning of complex financial products, derivatives, etc.
Yeah.
And from there, we saw the development of hyper abstracted ways of understanding the dynamics of those markets through the Black Scholes models, which became the underpinnings of the early days of algorithmic trading. Right? And so what's become dominant in the United States politically and economically is actually the forces of finance capital and the abstractions that they are obsessed with. That's the difference. And if you looked at, and this goes, your scam summary is a consequence of that because those four things exploded from the early 1990s when American financial institutions began creating these so-called products, convincing people that they needed these products to keep up with the Joneses. Because you have to remember that the backdrop to all of this, so the conjunctural backdrop, the 30, 40-year backdrop, was stagnant real wages.
Mm-hmm.
And some researchers have talked about this as the emergence of private credit on the promise that they could liberate American households from the tyranny of earned income. But of course, it did none of that. American households were trapped in the tyranny of earned income where real income did not rise and where the cost of living
Sure.
grew at a faster rate that had to be supplemented and made possible only by the expansion of private credit.
That is fascinating. The last question I have, and to bring our conversation for this time, because I think the book deserves much more than just one session. Is there a similar pattern in the way that America today is looking at this technology race and AI by just being purely focused on rare earths rather than that flow of energy that you were talking about? I recently read that Jameson Greer, US Trade Representative, is telling the allies that, hey, you have to pay a national security premium. And today, the cover of Financial Times, it's saying to boost its lead, the US must halt all exports of AI chips to China. Again, it goes back to Strait of Malaga, and and maybe it's it's a politics of deprivation of the
Yes.
counterparty rather than development or co-development. Do I get it right? Or
Yeah, look, beggar thy neighbor, the politics of deprivation or what have you. But those two stories that you mentioned are actually quite fascinating, aren't they? Because um, obviously the West, broadly speaking, the United States, over the course of the last 40 odd years, um, in effect, gave up on, if you will, the rare earths industry. And the rare earths industry then became something that China progressively developed and became better and better at and expanded its global footprint and developed new technologies to refine rare earths to even higher levels of purity at less energetic costs, etc., etc. But this happened in large part because of financialization that I talked about. When, if you think 50 years back, uh, the Chinese had very little rare earths industry at all. It was predominantly an American technology underpinned industry. So the Americans actually walked away from it, or American capital walked away from it, and government really wasn't too worried about it because, of course, they were those businesses became more profitable, offshoring things to cheap places that could run dirty businesses and repatriate the profits. American capital's been doing that now for 50, 60 years. And it's reached a conclusion, of course, that without these things, and we saw it last year in the tariff wars, that its exposure on this question meant that, the country that it views as an adversary and an enemy and all these things has leverage. But of course, to develop all of this stuff now requires a massive commitment of resource, huge amounts of resource, technical resource, energy infrastructure, machinery, human skills, knowledge, you name it.
The
And
overhead on environment to just,
so very big resource commitments are needed. And these resource commitments need to be mobilized financially. And because we're looking at making a massive commitment, the West is making this, or the United States more to a point, and companies and with the support of government, uh, these activities are going to be financially expensive. And what the West and the United States is actually worried about is that as they do this, and if China releases more product in the market and drops the price too low, then it renders all of these activities unviable. And so they're literally saying that we're going to have a price floor, we're going to regulate a price floor, and we're going to make our so-called allies pay the difference. We're going to say to you, bad luck, you can't get the cheap stuff that China makes available to the market. You're actually going to have to pay the United States extra for the United States to develop these industries. That's the first thing. And how sustainable that is for the US economy and for the rest of the world is going to be an interesting problem, right? Because you got to remember that as the cost of a particular activity goes up in a system, it tends to draw to it other resources. So if you have to pay people more to go and work in a particular industry, it draws people away from other industries. Right, so the United States, I saw a report yesterday that the United States mining industry, and this is why it's got a problem, the mining industry by 2030 is going to lose about half of its workforce through retirement. 220,000 mining workers will actually retire. And without those workers, and assuming that the United States is, and technologically wise, it's going to be difficult anyway. You can't automate all of those roles. So you're going to need a lot of new workers, which means you've got to pay those workers handsomely to get people off other industries. Australia's had this episode now twice at least, where a mining boom sucked resources out from other parts of the economy, gave rise to what's known as the Dutch disease effect, which is essentially increased costs everywhere else, right? Which then caused problems in the rest of the economy, in other sectors. So you can see in the Australian experience where mining booms was accompanied by episodes of manufacturing decline, as it
fascinating.
sucked resources out. And the United States runs the same risk. The second story you mentioned about, banning chips and all of that. Well, what was it last year, late last year sometime, the restrictions on Nvidia exporting H200 chips was lifted. And you know what? In the course of the last 6 months, they have sold precisely zero. Zero. Because in a sense, having banned these, high level microprocessors 7 years ago, 8 years ago, China's only response was to try and build its own industry. And so it did. Now, Chinese microprocessors are still not of the same standard, but they are good enough and improving quickly to a point where, and the timing of that second story is in a sense quite poetic. On the same day that that story comes up, DeepSeek releases its new model. And its new model has performance levels that matches anything else around, but it's cheaper to run. And it is now calibrated to run also on the new Huawei chip. Now, the constraint at the moment on this new model is that the Huawei chip has not gone into full mass production. But it is expected that those chips will go into full mass production in the second half of this year.
Fascinating.
Um, so, as America talks about, or as American politicians, more to the point, talk about banning more things, the rest of the world, and in this case, China, has actually just moved on. They're not waiting for the Americans anymore. They're focused on having to deal with the challenges and the opportunities of their own national economic development and security. And at this stage in time, they're doing it reasonably successfully.
Fascinating. Yesterday on LinkedIn, a gentleman called Peter Peverelli wrote about the story of the Central Pacific Railroad, where the Chinese workers came and they literally moved the mountain, and they were around 12,000 Chinese men. And I wrote back and I said, Peter, perhaps this time when President Trump goes to Beijing, because they used to call them celestial workers, right? That they don't need just to talk about rare earths, but also the power of making things done. And I think you brought a powerful story and picture into this thermoeconomics, Warwick. I want to thank you very, very much. Where can our audience find your book? And I will, of course, put the link in the comments, but where is your book accessible? And I highly encourage them to get a copy of it and go through it because this is a timely read for the times we live in. So,
Yeah, look, thanks for having me again. It's good to talk about these issues. The book, Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters, is available on Amazon. I chose to self-publish the book this time because my discussions with academic publishers that I've worked with before and others um, had two barriers for me. One was publishing lead times, which is too long. But probably more importantly is that the academic publishing model is very much geared to institutions. They do a
true.
fantastic job in creating great products, editors, and production values, but it means that the books themselves are actually incredibly expensive, and I just did not want that. So I'm experimenting with this self-publishing path. So it's available on Amazon. There's actually a little companion book that goes with it, which is a little less well known, but because it's not one that sort of, in a sense, goes into this sort of depth, called The Provenance Economy. And it's literally
Very
an
interesting.
80-page handbook, right? So they're both on Amazon. The
Fantastic.
Substack, of course, Ali, is where I publish once or twice a week. Lately, it's been twice, but I don't want people to get into the habit of expecting things all the time like that. But there has been quite a lot to say, and because things are on related themes, I've been able to be reasonably productive. But so that's warwickpowell.substack.com.
I'm delighted to have you with us. To our audience, do please subscribe if you like, share, and join us for what I say. You know, I always say at Futurely, my aim is to say, forget the events and focus on the trends. And Warwick is a trendsetter in supply chains and digital economy and anything that is got of value. So thank you for the value you brought to our talk, Warwick. I wish you a great night and see you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.